The Bible has over 31,000 verses, but about 18 years of Jesus' life, from age 12 to 30, not a single one says a word, not one line. He vanishes completely from every record. Then, suddenly, he reappears at 30 years old, ready to change the world. So, where was he during those 18 years? Here's what history and legend say about the most mysterious gap in the Bible. The Gospel of Luke tells us that at age 12, Jesus traveled with his parents on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He got separated from the group, and they found him sitting in the temple, deep in discussion with the religious teachers, leaving everyone stunned by his understanding. That's the last detail we get about his childhood. After that, total silence, until Luke picks the story back up with one line. Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. 18 years, gone. Scholars call this a narrative vacuum. And like any gap in history, people hate silence. So they filled it with dozens of theories, ranging from plausible to downright wild. The first theory, and the one taken most seriously by scholars, is that Jesus lived among the Essenes, a strict, ascetic Jewish sect that isolated itself in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. This is the very community believed to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Essenes lived a life of discipline, awaited an apocalyptic reckoning, and believed a Messiah was coming. Some of Jesus' later teachings about humility, judgment, and communal sharing of wealth show striking parallels to Essene thought. But this is still speculation. There's no record confirming Jesus was ever there. Just coincidences intriguing enough to keep researchers curious. Before we get to the big theories, the desert, India, England, Egypt, it's worth knowing that ancient writers tried to fill this silence almost immediately. And what they came up with is stranger than almost anything modern historians have proposed. In the centuries after Jesus' death, a handful of texts began circulating that claimed to describe his childhood in vivid detail. The most famous is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, not to be confused with the separate, better-known Gospel of Thomas, written sometime in the 2nd century, more than 100 years after the events it claims to describe. In this text, a 5-year-old Jesus doesn't just play by the riverbank. He molds 12 sparrows out of wet clay, claps his hands, and brings them to life, sending them flapping off into the sky. In another passage, a boy accidentally bumps into him running through the village, and Jesus curses him on the spot, and the boy simply drops dead. Terrified neighbors beg Joseph to control his son. In yet another scene, a young Jesus corrects his own schoolteacher on the meaning of the Hebrew alphabet, embarrassing the grown man in front of the whole class. It's a strange, almost unsettling mix of divine power and childish temper. Nothing like the calm, wise preacher of the 4 Gospels we actually know. Early Christian leaders rejected this text almost immediately, and it's easy to see why. It never made it into the Bible. Scholars now classify it, along with several similar writings, as apocryphal, a word that essentially means outside the accepted canon. Most historians view these stories not as suppressed history, but as later legend building, ordinary human storytelling rushing in to fill a silence the real historical record left wide open. Still, these apocryphal Gospels matter for one important reason. They prove that people were already obsessed with this exact same mystery within 100 years of Jesus' death. The desert, India, and England theories we're about to cover aren't some modern internet invention. They're just the latest chapter in a habit almost as old as Christianity itself. The most controversial theory comes from a book published in 1894 by Russian writer Nicholas Notovich. He claimed to have found an ancient manuscript at Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, India, describing a figure named Isa, said to be Jesus. who traveled to India, studied at Buddhist monasteries, then continued on to Tibet and Persia before returning to Judea. The story spread fast and became the foundation for countless modern theories claiming Jesus studied Eastern philosophy before he ever began preaching. But there's a serious problem. When Western scholars traveled to Hemis Monastery to verify the claim, the head lama stated flatly no Westerner had stayed there in the past 15 years, and no such manuscript existed. Two independent researchers, Max Muller and Archibald Douglas, later co-wrote a book refuting the claim entirely, with a title that leaves no room for doubt: Jesus did not live in India. A captivating story, but one most historians consider a fabrication. In England, a legend has persisted for centuries that Joseph of Arimathea, a tin merchant, and in some versions, Jesus' own uncle, brought young Jesus with him to Cornwall and Glastonbury during trading voyages. The legend continues that Joseph later returned to England carrying the Holy Grail, burying it at Glastonbury. William Blake's famous early 19th century poem, later turned into the hymn Jerusalem, was directly inspired by this legend, asking the poetic question, did those feet, in ancient times, ever walk upon England's green and pleasant land? It's a beautiful story, but like the India theory, there's zero historical evidence behind it. This one belongs more to Arthurian myth than actual history. There's a fourth theory, quieter than the others, but favored by a number of historians who study the ancient world, that Jesus never left the region at all, but instead traveled south into Egypt. We already know from the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus' family fled to Egypt as refugees when he was an infant, escaping King Herod's massacre of newborn boys. Some scholars ask a simple follow-up question: what if that connection to Egypt didn't end there? In this theory, a teenage Jesus returns to Egypt, this time to Alexandria, then the greatest center of learning in the entire ancient world, home to a vast library and a large, thriving Jewish community that blended Hebrew scripture with Greek philosophy. Supporters point to Jesus' later teaching style, his use of parables, his comfort debating abstract philosophical ideas, as evidence of exposure to this kind of intellectual environment. Critics counter that this theory rests on even thinner evidence than the others, mostly inference and educated guesswork, with no manuscript, no inscription, nothing physical to back it up. Still, unlike the India and England stories, at least this one doesn't require inventing a document that later turned out not to exist. So, where does the truth actually sit? Most modern historians and biblical scholars agree on one thing: there's no evidence Jesus ever left the region of Galilee. Most likely, he simply grew up like any other son in a Jewish household of that time, learning a trade. The original Greek word used is tekton, which means builder or craftsman, working alongside his father in Nazareth. No miracles, no continent-spanning journeys, just an ordinary, quiet, working life in a small town under Roman rule. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of the whole story, that before becoming one of the most influential figures in human history, he spent most of his life simply living an entirely normal one. There's a fifth theory, and it's the one that requires the least imagination of all, but it might explain the evidence better than any of the others. When the adult Jesus shows up in the Gospels, he doesn't just quote scripture. He debates it, fluently, with trained religious authorities, in the specific back-and-forth style rabbis used to argue fine points of Jewish law. Some scholars believe this points to something simple: formal religious education, right there in Galilee. In first-century Jewish communities, boys from religious families often studied under a local rabbi or synagogue teacher, memorizing large portions of Torah by heart and progressing, if they showed promise, into deeper study of Jewish law and interpretation. The 12-year-old boy, astonishing scholars in the temple, isn't necessarily a one-time miracle in this theory. It's a snapshot of a bright student who kept studying for the next 18 years, simply outside of Jerusalem, in ordinary synagogue schools that left no written record because nobody thought to document a promising local student. Not yet, anyway. This theory doesn't require Jesus to have traveled anywhere unusual at all. It fits neatly with the working-class carpenter's life described elsewhere in the Gospels, treating his religious education and his manual trade as two halves of the same ordinary, observant Jewish upbringing, common enough that nobody in Nazareth would have thought it was worth writing down. It's the least cinematic of all 5 theories. No desert monastery, no Himalayan manuscript, no Holy Grail. But for many historians, that's exactly why it's the most credible. Looking back at all these theories, the Essenes, India, England, there's something interesting they reveal. They show how badly humans crave a grand explanation for greatness. We struggle to accept that one of the most world-changing figures in history could have simply had 18 completely ordinary years. But maybe that silence is the real lesson here. Greatness doesn't always start with an extraordinary journey. Sometimes it's shaped quietly, in labor, in patience, in years nobody bothered to write down. So, which theory do you believe? Drop your guess in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into history's biggest religious mysteries, subscribe because the next one gets even wilder.